Welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the question of whether or not morality has an objective foundation, something that is right and true and is not a matter of human opinion, but rather is something that goes beyond that opinion and therefore can be a foundation because it's not something that humans have created. And so we're going to be trying to answer the question of whether or not morality has an objective foundation. So that's going to be the purpose of this lecture. So humanity has tried to found morality on several different things, on several different ideas. One of them has been meaninglessness, as we saw with existentialism. And we saw some of the issues, some of the problems with that, and how, if it's the case that everything's meaningless, then even human morality is meaningless, and therefore it can't be a value or it can't be a foundation for morality, because there is no such thing. Everything is meaningless. Another theory that we have looked at, or that we've talked about briefly, was human value. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through this lecture. I'm going to give you a list here, and then we're going to go through these as we move through the lecture. And so one of the things that people have tried to base it on is human value. We've tried to base it on the practical. If you look at a philosophy called pragmatism, you'll see that it attempts to answer the question of a foundation for morality based on the practical or the pragmatic. We've seen David Hume try to say that morality is based on the five senses. In this lecture, we're going to also look at pleasure, that the foundation for morality is pleasure and pain. Science is the foundation. Logic is the foundation. We're going to look at several of those as we move through the lecture and see if they will succeed or if they are something that ultimately won't succeed in being an objective foundation for morality. Okay. So how do we know if something is morally right or wrong? Just what is it? What is the basis for coming to understand that some type of action is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? What's a foundation that allows that, say for example, that torturing an innocent child for fun is morally wrong? What's the foundation for that? What's the foundation for saying that rape is wrong, murder is wrong, racism is wrong, and all other such things are somehow objectively wrong, not subjectively wrong, not dependent on the individual's views or on the culture's views, but rather this is universal in the sense of that, and it's wrong for everybody, and it's always been that way, and it's right, even if those individuals thought it was, and it's always been wrong, even if those individuals thought it was the right thing for them to do. Is there any type of foundation that would allow that these things really just are wrong? All right, so quickly, by objectively it is meant that such actions are wrong whether or not a person's feelings or opinions are different. If someone disagrees, say for example a person disagrees and thinks that rape is right, an objective moral value just says that individual's wrong about what they think, right? Subjectively, that would be true for them, but objectively, they would just be wrong. Is there a foundation for that kind of moral, objective right and wrong? Part of the argument that we're going to be exploring in today's lecture is the argument that many philosophers have put forward in the past, but it's gaining resurgence in recent decades. There has been a coming back to this question and a re-exploring the question of the argument that the answer is no. Unless there is a deity of some sort, unless there is a God, then objective moral values don't exist. And so that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at a lot of different arguments from the more modern perspective of without this deity, there is no moral right and wrong. And if you're looking in the notes at all, you'll see that what I've done is I've put the word God, but I have a small g, and then I've underlined it, okay? And so I do this to distinguish between multiple different kinds of deities, right? And I try to use the word deity most of the time in my classes because that seems to be less confusing, but sometimes people get kind of stumped because they're not used to God being called just the deity or deity. The reason that I don't capitalize it is because in the Western traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, They capitalize that word because it's a name. It's a name, and it directly applies to a specific being. And so capital G, God, applies specifically to this individual that they call God, but it's a name, just like I have a name. And so it's a name. Small g God is, say, for example, perhaps in the Hindu tradition, where they've got a bunch of little gods or small gods, but it's not the one. It's not the one with a name. The reason that I have put a small g and then underlined it is that what I mean here is that it's not a name, it's a title, right? And so I'm not saying the Judeo-Christian Muslim God, which the one that I'm referring to here is just kind of a generic, it could be any God. It doesn't really matter for our purposes, especially we'll see as we get to the end of this. It doesn't matter for our purposes which God in particular, so I don't use the one with a big G because that refers to the Judeo-Christian Muslim one. I'm just talking about some kind of title, and a title is not part of a person's name. So for example, part of my title is professor, but that's not my name. That just says what I do. Part of a person's title might be the word doctor, but that's not a name. That's just what they do. And so in this case, when we're saying God and we say God, we don't mean big G God, we don't mean the little g God like in the Hindu faith, but rather in this case it's a title. It's just something that God does. And so God might be creator, or God might be, in this case, the foundation for objective morality. There's lots of things that God can be, but that's, in our case, the way I'm using this, it's a title and not a name. I am a professor, but professing is not just part of my name, and it's not all that I do. There's more to me than just professing. So in this case, I'm not referring to any specific deity, right? And so I know that that's going to be confusing. It's going to stump a lot of you, especially if you're part of a faith background or if you're, say, against all faith backgrounds. And so I'll say the word God, and you'll have immediate positive or negative feelings about that particular word. And it's one of the reasons I try to stick with the word deity as much as I can, but you'll see there in the notes it's going to be God underlined, right? And so I'm just referring to a kind of a generic unknown. This could be anything that's out there. At this point, we don't know anything about that being, and the nature of that being is inconsequential. It's not really necessarily important for what we're doing today. The only question really is the idea of if there's an objective, if there is a foundation for objective morality, God is one of the options. And there are other options that we're going to explore as we go through this, but that one's going to be the focus because it's one of the big ones. It's one of the important foundations that is one of the possibilities, as we'll see as we go through this lecture. Okay, so, all right, so the claim here is that unless God exists, all that is left is merely human moral opinion, right? And so part of the claim that we're going to be exploring here is that God could be an objective foundation for morality, but the other options that we're going to be looking at, those are just human opinion, and so they can't be an objective foundation for morality. We'll kind of see how that plays out as we move forward. Further, it is certainly true that some things are matters of opinion, and here is kind of a caveat, and this is one of the things that most of my students make sure you keep this in mind as we move through this. As we mentioned before, some things, some morals are subjective. Some morals are seemingly objective, and there is a distinguishing category, right? Now, they might not be morally objective, but what I'm saying is that some things seem to be more importantly wrong than others. So something like rape or torturing children for fun, genocide, those types of things seem to be in a really kind of a different category than, say, for example, remember us using the example of women who go topless in certain cultures. That seems to be really subjective, not morally objective, right? So there really seems to be a differential in categories, so keep that in mind. We're not saying that all morals are either subjective or objective. That's not what's being claimed here. The claim is that if there is some type of foundation, then some things could be morally, objectively wrong. And so that doesn't mean everything is, right? Okay. Hopefully you kind of keep that in mind. Remember that as we go through, because that distinction is definitely very, very important. Okay. So those who do not believe in God, and remember the God underlined, right? Those who do not believe in a deity often object by saying that a person does not need to acknowledge any kind of deity to understand moral right and wrong, and that is absolutely the case. You do not need to believe in a deity of any sort in order to be a good person, or to even really understand and reflect on the fact of morality, that some things seem to be right or wrong. You don't need to believe in a deity for that. I know plenty of people who are atheists who are good people and they have a sense of moral right and wrong that is really, really important to them. On the other hand, I know plenty of people who are theists and of certain faiths often, who are theists at the very least, who are morally reprehensible people. And yeah, they may claim that they believe in some type of moral system, but they don't behave accordingly. In fact, they violate it, and quite often. So just believing in a deity or disbelieving in a deity doesn't make you either a good or a bad person. And so it's just a matter of looking then and reflecting on those moral concepts and precepts or presuppositions that individuals have. But you can't distinguish that someone's either good or bad by knowing if they're an atheist or a theist of some sort. And so I sometimes, and in this case, very much joking, right? But sometimes in my class I refer at this point to those dirty atheists, to those nasty atheists, because the vast majority of people in my classroom are theists of some type. And so when I refer there to the dirty atheist, everybody kind of smiles because they understand that it's a joke. You don't distinguish whether somebody's good or bad based on the simple fact of whether or not they believe in a deity. So we want to be clear. We want to make sure that people understand that that's certainly the case, right? That's not part of the claim in this particular argument that we're going to be looking at. Instead, the argument is, so here is the argument, that in order to ground an objective moral law, you need to have a transcendent source or foundation for those values, for those laws. Now, transcendent, again, I know we talked about this in a previous lecture, but it just means that something stands outside of. It's not part of this. So to transcend means to be not part of a particular system. You stand outside that system, and then you might influence what's happening within that system, right? So it stands outside of. You can't have something in the system that is determining morality as part of the argument in this. Kind of see what that means. So for some of the answers that are also important to understand when it comes to understanding a foundation for objective morality, science is one of the most prominent current foundations for objective morality. And so we want to take a close and careful look at how science might or might not be the foundation for objective morality. So let's look quickly here. Remember us talking in a previous lecture about a movement called positivism. And within positivism, this happened in the early 1900s, within the movement, remember that they proclaimed that the only way that you could know something was true was if you could prove it scientifically. And if you remember, the problem for that particular position was that later thinkers, a couple years later in this case, they came to realize that you couldn't prove the statement, the only way you can know something is true is to know it scientifically. They couldn't prove that statement scientifically. So by its own criteria, positivism failed. It failed because it could not itself stand up to its own criticism. There's no way you can prove scientifically that the only way you can know truth is to know it scientifically. So positivism failed at its very foundation, right? Now, looking at current science, because that was the early 1900s, but this idea of science all right, so the idea that science is the way to know, in this case, to gain moral knowledge, is part of a bigger worldview called scientism. And within scientism, remember I was talking about worldviews, but within scientism, the idea is that the only is that science will bring to us all answers, not just answers about morality, but all answers that there are. And remember that when we put that ism on the back end of a word, it becomes a philosophy, or it becomes a worldview, a way of thinking about or seeing the world. Now, the trouble with this claim, I'm sorry, this is often understood by scientists in our culture. Not all scientists think this way, but a great many, and a very, very great many of the very popular and well-known scientists today are of the worldview that science is the only way for us to get answers, and that it will bring to us all answers. And again, for us in an ethics class, that's certainly going to include science. So then, looking at one of the very well-known scientists in our culture today, for an example, here is a quote from Stephen Hawking. This is in May 2001, and it's at the Google Zeitgeist forum on the theme, Why Are We Here? And so Hawking's is addressing the audience in this case, although he does say something similar to this in one of his books. But here, at this particular one, here's what he says. And so, quote, why are we here? As a part of the answer to this theme, here is what he said. And now the quote. Most of us don't worry about these questions most of the time, but almost all of us sometimes wonder, why are we here? Where do we come from? Traditionally, these questions are for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophers have not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. And then he goes on to claim this. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. And, he says, new theories, and then the quote continues, new theories lead us to a new and very different picture of the universe. And I have a misprint here. Lead us to a new and very different picture of the universe, right? So, what he's saying here in this particular quote, with the exception of my quick there we go. Right. With my quick typo. Leads us to a new and very different picture of the universe. But the basic idea here is that science is the one that is where we now turn to get the pictures of the universe and the way it is. And so it used to be that we turned to philosophy to get answers like this, but now we just turn to science, because science is the thing that's going to give us answers to those questions. It's going to give us answers to all questions. That's scientism, the idea that science is, that's that philosophy or worldview that science is going to give us all answers. So in this case, he's also declared that philosophy is dead. In these quotes, it's really important that you look at them carefully and try to see which one of those quotes he can prove using science. Because remember, he's saying that science is going to give us the answers to these questions. So look at the quotes, think about those quotes, and try to see which of them he can actually prove scientifically. And the answer very clearly, very quickly becomes none. And in fact, all of those statements that he's making are philosophical in nature. None of them are scientific in nature. All of them are philosophical in nature. And so here what we see is that Hawking's is misunderstanding the difference or the nature of philosophy, and in this case the difference in nature of science. He doesn't seem to grasp the simple fact that what he's doing here in these statements is that he is using philosophy to try to declare that philosophy is dead, right? And you can't do that. You can't use the thing that you're trying to claim is unimportant. You can't use to try to find answers or even to try to find questions. You can't use the thing that you can't declare that the thing that you're using is useless while you're using it. That's a contradiction. That's a logical misstep, right? But all too often, a lot of scientists don't realize that what they're doing really is part of a philosophical discussion and really hasn't anything to do with science. And so that led another scientist to declare that maybe Hawking's, maybe he hadn't kept up with philosophy and how it had developed. He's declaring that philosophers here in this case, that they hadn't kept up with physics. But, well, maybe, and it would seem very clear here, that he hasn't kept up with philosophy because he doesn't even recognize that what he's doing is philosophy. What has escaped Hawking's understanding here is that science tells us the way the world is, but it can't tell us why we're here, and it can't tell us how the world should be, right? It can tell us how to measure the world, but it can't tell us why the world is the way it is. It can't tell us why the world is. It can't tell us why the world is the way it is, and it can't tell us how the world should be. How the world should be, how it should look, is a matter of philosophical approach. Now, science can measure lots of different things and do it exceedingly well, but it can't give us the why of anything. That's a question that does remain in the philosophical world, in the sense of why we're here. Now, it can tell us why a stone falls, from our hand to the ground, but it can't tell us why the world was set up that way. It can tell us the ins and outs, for example, of the effects of, say, rape on another individual, right? What effects does rape have both on the rapist and the rapee, the one who's being raped? Science can look at those two individuals, and it can give us a biological and even psychological, neurological understanding of what's happening in the minds of those individuals, but it can't begin to tell us why necessarily that's wrong. It can just tell us how the world is, but it can't tell us why the world's that way, and neither can it, because it could have been another way, neither can it tell us that it should be different. It can't tell us that it ought not be, that there ought not be a world, say, where little children are in fact tortured and killed for fun. Science can't touch that question. It's outside of its realm. It's outside of its jurisdiction. And so we have to look to something else. And so, put crudely, science measures the material stuff of the universe, but it can't tell us how the stuff should behave. That's not an answer that science can give to us. That's outside of its realm of jurisdiction. So science is one thing that it sometimes is used as an attempt for a foundation for morality, but it's just outside of its realm. It's not something that it can really talk to us about. And so there's another idea that has often been put forward as a foundation, one of the possible foundations for objective moral rights and wrongs, and that thing is logic. And so logic, though, in this case, is limited, because logic can only tell us when there's an error in thinking. It can only tell us when there's an error in thinking, but it can't give to us value claims. It can't say to us, rape is wrong or torturing toddlers for fun is wrong. It can't do that. All it can do is say, there's an error in your thinking over here. This way of thinking and this way of thinking don't line up. They're illogical or they're self-contradictory. It can't, in this case, give us an answer to the question. So remember when we were discussing the law of non-contradiction, and I said that the law of non-contradiction can tell us that there can't both be physical milk in this fridge and not be physical milk in that same fridge at the same time and in the same relationship. Logic tells us that there can't both be milk in the fridge and not milk in the fridge, but logic cannot tell us if it cannot tell us which, rather. It can't tell us which of those two answers is right and which one is wrong. The only way we could come to know in that case would be to open the refrigerator and look at it, but we can't logically come to a conclusion there is or there isn't milk. Logic won't distinguish between those two answers. At least it won't distinguish between those two answers unless we have further or more or better information, right? And so in this case, logic won't give us an answer between those two ideas. It just points out an error in thinking, but it can't tell us, say, for example, the value of human freedom versus slavery. That's nothing that logic can do. it might be able to tell us that it can't be true that slavery is both objectively morally good and objectively morally bad. Well, their logic can say they can't both be right, but it can't tell us which one is right. And so logic, again, because it's kind of like math. It's cold and it's calculating, but it can't address the question of value in this case. So some have also claimed that, moving on from logic, some have also claimed that evolution could be a foundation for morality, meaning that we evolved into morality. And so since we evolved into what we are today, that really is the condition. That's the right way of understanding that, say, morality is objectively this way because these creatures, humans, have morally evolved as we have gone through our moral development, and therefore that's the foundation for objective morality. The problem with that particular position is that if it's the case, if it's true that we evolve morally as we move along, then those past cultures, say, for example, some of the ones who are particularly, in our opinion, nasty, what they were doing then wasn't objectively morally wrong. It was just their current evolutionary moral position. They had simply evolved into that position. So what they were doing wasn't necessarily wrong because they had evolved into that condition, and at that time, that's what they thought was morally right or morally wrong, and so they did or didn't do it. And that continues on with us today, because if that theory is correct, then we're going to continue to evolve as we move forward. And if we continue to evolve, we may eventually evolve into a situation where we come to understand rape to be right, or we may come to understand slavery to be morally right, to be objectively morally the proper way for us to behave towards other humans. And so if that's the objective moral standard, well, then that objective moral standard simply changes along with our evolutionary changes. And so, in fact, it's not morally objectively an ethical foundation, because it's not objective at all. It's subjective according to where these creatures are in their evolutionary process. And so it's not objectively morally right or wrong. And it can, and in fact it will change, because as we evolve, we'll become different. And so evolution can't be a foundation for morally objective rights and wrongs, because it's going to continue to change as long as humans continue to evolve. And so that one's going to fail there as well. One of the ones I get most often in class is the simple kind of answer of, well, the objective morals are based on pleasure and pain, right? And so if it brings pleasure, then it's morally right, or if it brings pain, then it's morally wrong. There are some things, though, that bring pleasure and that are, in fact, immoral. And there are some things that are the opposite of pleasurable, and they are precisely what ought to be done at those different times. If you look at the rapist, we've already talked about Ted Bundy. If you look at Bundy, he comes to understand that what he's doing is morally right, and for him, it is definitely pleasing. It's something that is pleasurable for him. Well, if it's pleasurable for him, then according to this theory, if it brings pleasure, then it's right or good, morally good. But we don't necessarily, we understand that that's not necessarily the case. Just because something brings pleasure, that doesn't mean that it's morally good or right or true. It just means that that particular entity, that particular person, happens to enjoy what it is that they're doing. But that doesn't mean that it's right or good. It just means that they enjoy it. Also, kind of the other side of that is, just because something is the opposite of pleasurable doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. If you look at soldiers who are behaving courageously in combat, what they're doing isn't necessarily pleasurable. In fact, it's the opposite of pleasurable, but they understand that they're doing something that is perhaps, not always, not all soldiers in combat understand that what they're doing is right or good, but in this case, many of them are going to understand that what they're doing is right or good, because they're fighting, say, for the country. They're fighting for their loved ones. They're fighting for their land. There's lots of different reasons that soldiers have gone into war and fought, and they understand that what they're doing is not pleasurable, but why they're doing it is right and good, and so they're willing to continue in those actions even though they're not pleasurable. And so we can think of any number of things that bring a great deal of displeasure, the opposite of pleasure, but we understand them to be morally good. And we can think of any number of things that are pleasurable that are morally reprehensible. And so it doesn't seem that pleasure and pain can really be a guide for what is morally right or wrong. It seems that there has to be something more to it than simply than this. If it were true that it was just pleasure and pain, then most people's morality would also constantly just shift with their guts. That is to say, how it made you feel at the moment. You know, one moment it might make you feel good, the next moment it might make you feel bad, and so morality is constantly moving around, and you can't have a foundation. No foundation that moves around is a good foundation for something that is supposed to be objectively morally right or wrong. There are more ideas that have been put forward than the ones that we've looked at here, and all too briefly. This is certainly not meant to be comprehensive. It's meant to get you thinking. This is an introduction class, right? So if you're interested in one of these theories and you want to learn more about the different arguments that I'm presenting here, there's so much volume out there, right? Go look, be thorough, just be sure that you read people you both agree with and that you disagree with, right? That's what education is. Yes, and so there's more of the different theories about what could constitute a foundation for objective moral values. But really for us here, what's key for us is the concept that all of these notions that are being put forward are some type of human construct. They're something that humans have come to understand and put forward and posit in some way for an objective moral foundation. The difficulty here being that they really are humans. It's something that's being created or explained or used by humans to try to achieve this idea of an objective moral foundation. The problem is that when you look at these human-made things, you always find issues. You always find some type of problem that is certainly going to make it not be something that is a foundation for something that's morally objectively true, because they're all going to have that one little problem that they are either created by or somehow understood by humans, in the sense of understood in the sense of that we don't necessarily create logic. It's something that we discovered, and that we discovered the principles of logic. We didn't necessarily create it. We are going to get to a couple here that humans did in fact create, but in that case, you know, that logic, we don't create it, but it's still something that we take and we use those principles and we try to we explain things through those principles. But in logic, in this case, with that example, it's something that lies outside of morality, lies outside of the realms of logic, and so we're trying to apply things that are of a different category. And so if you're studying one type of science, you've got that particular category, and it deals with what it deals with. Within logic deals with the right way of thinking, but it doesn't deal in morality because it's outside the realm of that particular science. Logic is a science. And so that seems to be the struggle here within humanity, looking for that objective foundation, is that these things are outside of the realm of, say, chemistry. Morality lies outside of the realm of chemistry. It lies outside of the realm of these different things that we've looked at, the pleasure and pain and all those different things. It seems to be something quite different, something that's else. Okay, now suppose the atheists are right and there is no God. Remember our little g underline God. Suppose that the atheists are right and there is no deity. In fact, there is nothing but the physical world. There's nothing out there but just the physics, and there's nothing but chemistry and biology. What that would mean, if there's nothing but chemistry and biology, is that there is no morally good or bad. Why? Because no combination of chemicals just is evil. Think about it for just a moment. Think about all the different chemical compounds and different chemical reactions that are on our planet, and even within the universe itself, and tell me which of those chemicals, or even which of those chemical combinations, just is evil. Which of them is just the physical existence of evil embodied. And if only you removed one of these bits of chemical, then you wouldn't have evil in the palm of your hand. Instead, you'd have some other substance. But as soon as you add, this little chemical here, now this combination of chemistry is evil. Well, that's silly. That's nothing that is in reality, because there is no chemical combination that is just evil in and of itself. So there is nothing immoral about chemical combinations. Say, for example, the chemical combination of gunpowder. You might take gunpowder and use it to do something immoral, just like you might take the chemical compound, let's just say iron. You might take that metal and you might use it for something that's immoral, but iron itself isn't immoral. Gunpowder, the chemicals that make up gunpowder in that particular chemical compound, those things are not immoral in and of themselves simply because of chemistry. That's not the way that the universe works. We understand that. There's nothing in the chemistry of a rapist that is in and of itself immoral. Now, I do understand, because I know that one story, and I'm pretty sure it's included in one of the videos in this lecture series. But there is one story of a man who had a tumor, and that tumor caused him to have pedophilic tendencies. He became attracted to children, and so it was somewhere on his brain, and I want to say here it's somewhere in the prefrontal cortex. They removed it, and his urges towards pedophilia went away, and then later the tumor came back. And he began to have those urges again, and when they went back in, they found that the tumor had come back. So I understand that chemistry is part of this. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that no chemical ... in and of itself, no chemical compound just is evil itself. If it was, we could simply eradicate that chemical compound from existence, and then evil would be destroyed. But that chemical compound simply doesn't exist. Humanity has come to declare some of their actions, some actions as being immoral, but that is not because there are evil chemicals inside of people. If there is nothing but chemistry, good and evil are man-made ideas. So if it's not part of the physical existence of everything that's around us, then good and evil are really just things that humanity has come up with. Now, we're just walking, talking bags of chemistry ourselves. And so if there's nothing but chemistry, good and evil really are just an illusion that our chemical compounds, and in our case, our very complex chemical compounds, have put into our very complex brains, but they have no actual existence at all, no existence whatsoever. And so if everything's just chemistry, then our brains are really just feeding us this false idea of something that is it's not real. It's a figment of our brain chemistry. And so there is no such thing as good or evil. Those are man-made ideas. Further, man-made ideas change, as we've seen. We have seen moral ideas change throughout history. Slavery was once considered to be moral. Now it's not. Women are no longer considered to be a bargaining chip to be married off to the best man that brings the family financial gain. At least it's not done openly. Certainly it still happens, but it is considered to be immoral. You don't give your daughters to someone in marriage just because it brings financial gain to the family, or at least if it was done openly, many people would say that's wrong, that's immoral. Yeah, it used to be done all the time. Now it's considered to be immoral, and so that morality within it has changed. It is now considered immoral to marry your daughters off just for financial gain. Many ideas of what is immoral or immoral have changed. Perhaps most strikingly is the idea of natural human rights. That is, basic human rights are so much a part of our world today, it's hard to imagine that there was a time when human rights were not recognized. It's hard to imagine that there was a time when human rights really weren't part of the understanding of our history and of our way of thinking. but that is very much the case. The idea of human rights is a very, very recent concept. It's a concept that's only come about in the last couple hundred years. In uh, in the classical European languages, there wasn't even a word for rights, for human rights. That didn't exist. It was something that, again, has only come along in the last couple hundred years. In Asian languages, it was not until several centuries later, even after the Europeans came up with something like that, it wasn't until several centuries later that there was a word for rights. Rights did not exist, like human rights did not exist until humans created the concept. The concept of human rights is a man-made idea. So, where did they come from? Where did this idea of basic human rights come from? Because it's so prevalent in our culture, and we always talk about we have the right to, not just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but now we've got a right to this, and we've got a right to that, and we've got a right to this, and we've got a right to that. Where did this idea of basic human rights come from? Because it didn't always exist. Well, it's something that humans came up with. And so humans came up with this thing, and they didn't exist until humans did develop the idea. Where did it come from? Humans gave these rights to themselves. Humanity looked around and said, we have a right to life. We have a right not to be killed indiscriminately. Where did you get the right? We have declared this to be true of ourselves. If it didn't come from if there is no anything but chemistry, if there's nothing but chemistry, then where did this right come from? It came from a human's declaration of, and this is true of us. And so, in that case, based on what foundation becomes the question, what's the foundation for human rights, for this human declaration? Well, if it comes about because humans declare it to be true of themselves, what happens when another group of humans comes along and declares it to not be true of that particular set of individuals? Just like it was the case that human rights were declared to be the case all across Europe, but when the Nazis came along, they declared that the Jews didn't have natural human rights because they weren't as human, or they were less human, or they weren't human. It kind of depends on where you're at in the Nazi philosophy. But they come along and said no such thing. Jews, blacks, nope. They don't have the same kind of value as the master race, is what they called it. So, I mean, one group declared that they had basic human rights. Another group declares that that group over there doesn't have basic human rights. Well, which group's declaration gets to triumph and decide whether and who does in fact have basic human rights? And all too sadly, the answer is usually the person with the strongest military, or something like that, or the most money, meaning that they can come in and get their way because they influence people's economic position so much that you either have to go along with them or say perhaps to starve. And so when does one group of persons declaration get to triumph over another? Because humanity declared these things to be true of themselves, so other humans could declare it to be not true, either of themselves or of a different group. And which one of them has actual authority? So when we look at that idea that human rights are declared by humans, if there is no authority higher than humanity, morality is just whatever any group of humans declares, and other humans follow. And they might follow it because of force, or they might follow it freely. It doesn't really matter in this case. But whatever morality is declared by this group and other groups do, well, that's what's considered to be moral at the time. It goes back to that idea of herd morality that Nietzsche was talking about, right? It's just what everybody's kind of doing and going along with. This truth is acknowledged by leading atheists. For example, the most famous nihilistic philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, said, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, it does not exist." So there is no such thing as the right way. It's just different ways, and that's that. Also, Richard Dawkins, leading voice of atheism, says, "Humans have always wondered about the meaning of life. Life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Life has no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So, what is humanity? We're just DNA. And later in another quote, he says, and we dance to its strings. We are just what we are chemically. That's it. Nothing more. And if that's the case, then good and evil, right and wrong, those things don't exist. So, why do intellectually honest atheists admit that without God, objective moral values cannot exist? Because it is the logical result of taking atheistic philosophy to its logical conclusion. This is the logical position. If there is nothing but the physical material universe, and there is no such thing as a physical, material, chemical, evil compound, then good and evil are just illusions that humanity has within them. They do not exist. They do not exist. If there's no such thing as evil, you must assume there's no such thing as good. And if you assume there's no such thing as good, you assume if you assume there is such a thing as good, you assume there's such a thing as an absolute, unchanging moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. If you assume there's such a thing as an absolute moral law, you must posit an absolute moral lawgiver or foundation, but that would have to be a deity. That's something that stands outside of it, that transcends, because there is nothing within nature itself that is just good or evil, and so it must be something that stands outside of nature, and that can only be a deity or something like that. That's the one that the atheist wants to deny that exists, and so that's why Dawkins and others are saying, well, there is no such thing as good and evil, because they've come to understand that logically, if they declare that there are moral goods and moral evils, then they're going to have to bring in some type of deity. And that's the thing that they don't want. And so they have to declare that no such thing as moral rights or wrongs. Now, there are some atheists, Sam Harris, for example, who are going to try to set up a moral foundation, an objective moral foundation for morality without having the deity. But if you look closely, and with Harris in particular, you need to read his footnotes. What you're going to find is that all he really does is try to redefine something so that it's not what it was previously. And if you just redefine it, then you haven't really answered the question. Here's what I mean. There was a book that I was really keen to read once, which was Are Animals Moral? And within the first few paragraphs, what the individual did is all he did was redefine morality away from making a choice, being free and able to make a choice, to behaving according to instincts. And there within that first chapter, the answer to his question, he said the answer is yes, animals are moral creatures, but all he did was redefine what it meant to be a moral creature. Well, that's just kind of a misstep in logic. It's a misstep in trying to answer the question. You're not dealing fairly with what it is that we're talking about here. So he needs to address it fairly. And so what we see there with Sam Harris sometimes is that he simply just tries to redefine what it means to be to have an objective moral foundation. And so what you'll find that is with many of the atheistic philosophers, that they just say no, that we don't have a foundation. It is subjective. And so especially if you look at Peter Singer, who is a tremendous moralist, someone who writes in ethics, he's one of the ones who is responsible for giving to us the movement of animal rights, and he's very, very important within establishing animal rights that we've seen in our culture today. And so if you look at Peter Singer, one of the things that he has said is that he wishes, and he's an atheist, he said that he wishes that he had some type of objective foundation on which to place morality, but he understands that he doesn't. And so when you look at those intellectually and logically honest atheists, that's what they're saying. No such thing exists. It just simply isn't there without the deity, because all we're left with is chemistry, and chemistry again can't be it doesn't have evil or good within it. It simply is the chemical reactions that we see and study and understand. All right, so rewind. If there's not a moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. There's got to be something out there, some being out there that's giving to us a moral law, or no moral law exists because we don't see it in nature. So it has to come from outside of nature. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil, just as Richard Dawkins admits in the previous quote. At least at issue are the requirements for being able to have objective moral laws. Three things are needed in order to have objective moral laws. You have to have an unchanging authority, something that's not going to move. Your foundation can't move. You have to have an absolute and unchanging standard. There's got to be something out there that measures, and the measurement doesn't change. And here's what I mean. Imagine that, in the Museum of Weights and Measurements in France, there is a bottle that is a 2-liter bottle, right? And it is the standard by which all other bottles are measured. And what that means is that in so much as any other bottle has the exact amount of fluid, if it has the exact same amount of fluid that is contained there, right, within that 2-liter bottle, then it measures up and it is considered, say, a 2-liter bottle containing fluid at that point. It measures a 2-liter bottle. If it's more, then it's not a 2-liter bottle. If it's less, then it's not a 2-liter bottle, right? So this is the standard by which all other 2-liter bottles are measured. And so when we say a standard, there has to be a standard. There's got to be a measuring stick, and the measuring stick can't change. So imagine that we went into the museum there in France, and we constantly changed what was required for a bottle to be 2 liters. If it constantly changed, we would never really know what 2 liters was, because it would constantly be fluctuating. Imagine that we were playing a game of basketball, or a game of football is probably better, a game of football, and the goalposts were constantly being moved, right? And so that, in this case, if you move the moral goalpost, you're never really going to know what's morally right or wrong, because the goalpost keeps moving, and at one point this might be right, and at the next point it might be wrong. And so we have to have some type of standard that doesn't move, it doesn't shift. It's always measuring exactly the same way. And nature itself constantly moves. And so again, it's got to be that unchanging, that not moving standard. So we have to have an unchanging authority. We also have to have an unchanging standard. And there has to also, in this case, be absolute truth. Some things have to be absolutely true, right, or wrong. Now, morally, there must all be absolute truth, but it must be simply the case too that either there are objective moral rights and wrongs, or it must be absolutely true that there are not objectively moral rights and wrongs. And so absolute rights and wrongs would have to exist, aside simply from the fact of that some things are morally or objectively right or wrong, to the more simple case of that objective moral rights, or objective moral values would have to either exist or not exist. There must be an absolute truth between those two. And so that's one of the things that's necessary in order for there to be objective moral laws, is that there's got to be absolute truth as well. Absolute truth kind of in general. And then eventually it comes into the morality field as well. So that some things are wrong, absolutely wrong, morally in that case. If there were no absolute moral wrongs, then again, everything's subjective. It's just no standard, no authority. It just moves around all the time. So those 3 things would be necessary. Absolute unchanging authority, absolute unchanging standard, and absolute truth. Atheism and naturalism believe nothing is absolute, that everything is random, and that everything is changing. In such an environment, no one can ever be sure anything is truly and objectively morally right and wrong, because it's constantly in fluctuation, it's constantly changing. Without an unchanging absolute authority, there can be without an unchanging absolute authority that uses an unchanging absolute standard, which is based on right and unchanging truth, ethics simply becomes emotive and opinion. It's just up to whoever to decide and believe at any given time. So then rape isn't really wrong. It's just the fact that people don't like rape. But that's the strongest statement that you can make about it. You can't declare that it's absolutely wrong if there is no absolute rights and wrongs. All you can declare is that I don't like it. That's all you can ultimately declare. However, the rub comes from the fact that nearly every human being does recognize moral absolutes. It simply seems to be the case. Now, I understand that there are some Um, there are individuals who have a greater sense of moral right and wrongness, but it seems that everybody really kind of has this understanding of these things being right and these things being wrong. They recognize moral absolutes. Obviously, they're not always going to practice those moral absolute rights and wrongs, but they understand and acknowledge them. They might even try to find some type of justification for breaking a moral law. But if someone is trying to justify the fact that they're breaking a moral law, that means that they understand that it's a moral law, that they're doing something they shouldn't do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be trying to justify it. Obviously, they know they shouldn't do it. But if they're trying to justify what they're doing, they obviously know that their actions merit, they demand some type of justification. If I'm doing something that I know to be right, I don't try to justify it. I know that it's right and it doesn't need to be justified. But if I'm doing something that I think is wrong, I might try to excuse myself. I might come up with some kind of excuse in my head. Well, yeah, this is normally wrong. But in this case, I'm going to do it because these things make it the exception. Now, you only try to find ways to make exceptions if you understand that some things are right and some things are wrong. There is a difference in what a culture and its people are doing and what they ought to do. There's a difference between something that is descriptive and something that is prescriptive. That is to say, describing morally what's right and wrong, as opposed to what is in fact morally right and wrong. There's a difference in those two. We understand that. Just because people are behaving in one way and we describe their behavior in one way, that doesn't mean that they don't know that there's a way that what they're doing is wrong and that they should be doing it differently. So there's a difference in describing it, and there's a difference in that culture understanding that what they're doing is wrong. One thing that history has shown us is that humanity recognizes universal right and wrong, even across culture and time. Now, the Egyptian Book of the Dead that I've mentioned before talks about that idea where certain things are understood as being morally right and wrong. That moral right and wrong, if you don't take milk from the mouth of a baby, that seems to be universal. It's true, and it seems to be true across cultures, that you don't harm the innocent. Now, there are plenty of cultures that do harm innocents, but there seems to be that kind of pervasive knowledge of something about this is not right. It's wrong. We shouldn't be doing these things. And it seems to be that everyone has this, even though not everyone necessarily always follows it. Again, the Aztecs and the Assyrians, for example, the Assyrians were particularly vicious individuals, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily thought that everything that their culture was doing was right. It's just the way, in this particular case, that the military was behaving towards those individuals that they were trying to conquer. They were absolutely vicious when they marched up to cities' gates. In the beginning, they would submit cities that had fallen to them. They would do absolutely atrocious things to the individuals who had resisted them, so much so that people in the ancient world, eventually, when the Assyrians approached their gates, you just surrendered, because when they got inside, and they were masters of siege warfare, so they were going to get inside, once they got inside, the pain and the torment and the torture just was going to be overwhelming. So many cities just submitted. They just surrendered before the Assyrians even attacked them. So just because that one aspect of Assyria, of the Assyrian culture, behaved in that way, it doesn't mean that all Assyrians approved of that. It just means that that's the way that that particular part of that culture behaved. Just like in, I'm going to say American culture, because that's my culture. Not everything that happens in American culture is something that I approve of. I don't necessarily approve of it, but it might be part of the way our culture behaves. And that's going to be true of all cultures and all humans throughout history. But even within those cultures, even the ones that were some of the cruelest, who might murder and rape and steal, they might commit those types of crimes on their enemies. But many of these, most of these, are not then going to turn around and commit those same types of atrocities on members of their own country or their own culture. They're not going to turn around and perform those same types of activities. You don't, go into your own neighborhood, into your own culture, and do these types of things because those are your friends, those are your neighbors, and you don't want those kinds of bad, immoral things to happen to them. And so we see that type of thinking, that type of commitment to morality. As we study history, we seem to have this concept, all humans seem to have had this concept, that there is a basic moral right and there's a basic moral wrong. So where does this universal understanding of moral right and wrong come from? An understanding that transcends human opinion. That is to say, it seems to be something that goes above and beyond just what humans think or believe. Why does a small child know immediately when they've been treated unfairly or if something has been stolen from them? And in the last lecture I talked about how we don't have to teach our children that when someone takes their toy or takes their food, we don't have to teach them to come to other people and say, hey, I was treated unfairly. We don't have to teach them that. They know that. It seems to be just part of what humanity is, something that is deep within us and deep inside of us, that, hey, this moral law was broken and they took my toy. And we don't have to really explain that to children. They seem to have it intrinsically, meaning it's there within them already, and it seems to be very deeply woven in and very deeply embedded within them. True objective moral good cannot be defined without purpose, and purpose cannot be defined without a cause. Without cause, which is what the theist here is saying, is the cause of everything. Without God, the cause of everything, all that is left is time, matter, and chance. And so if you look at some of the physics of the universe, if all there is time, matter, and chance, then you can't get anything like purpose or meaning or any kind of value, because all you've got is the physical stuff and the chemistry of this universe. And so without there being something more than just time, matter, and chance, then you can't come up with this absolute moral framework, because that's something that seems to lie outside of chemistry. Again, there is nothing in chemistry that just is evil itself. It would seem there is something compelling us to preserve objective morality. Many atheists are fighting fiercely to preserve it. Again, that's applying this to Sam Harris. He seems to really want to preserve absolute moral rights and wrongs, objective moral rights and wrongs. Why do so many theories attempt to ground it in anything but God, anything but a deity, right? They're looking, they're searching, there's got to be something else, there's got to be something else. If there is no objective morality, why not simply accept this rather than trying to preserve something like that without a foundation? There seems to be some part of human nature that clings to the idea of objective rules of conduct, even while rejecting the idea of objective moral truths. So they don't want to claim that there are objective moral truths, but they desperately want to claim that there is a foundation for morality. Why aren't they just consistent? Why not just be consistent in your logic? Two well-known atheists seem to have missed this all-important understanding. Dawkins and Hitchens, right? So go listen to them, to their debates, go listen to them talk, and you'll see what I mean. They seem to be at odds with themselves. They don't seem to understand that when they look at the Old Testament, and Hitchens is a master, and you need to listen to him as he describes his perspective on the Old Testament, because what he talks about there, it's very compelling, especially if you're someone who takes the Old and New Testament as God's Word. Then go take a look at his perspective, because it's really going to help you see what the atheists are talking about. And it's really important. Remember at the beginning of the semester we talked about trying to understand people who think differently than we do. Hitchens is a master of looking at the Old Testament from an atheistic perspective. And so go listen to him, because it's really, really going to be worth your time to see what it is that he's trying to say. In debates, both Dawkins and Hitchens really voice very, very loudly that the God of those tales, of those stories, that the God who's telling these individuals what to do, that God is misbehaving and very, very badly. But the problem with declaring that what the Israelites are doing is misbehaving in the name of God, is that, again, they've taken the position that there's nothing but the physical material world. And if there's nothing but the physical material world, how could the Israelites be behaving badly? Because there's no such thing as badly. And so they'll come in to these debates and they'll very loudly proclaim that these things ought not ever happen. But what they seem to be missing is that they're declaring in other places there is no absolute truth. Why shouldn't the Israelites be doing these things? If everything is subjective, or if everything is cultural, if there is no absolute moral right and wrong, then why can't they behave in this way? And how could Dawkins or Hitchens even begin to declare that what they're doing is wrong? Because there is no absolute wrong according to Dawkins and Hitchens. And so they're making this kind of misstep in logic, and they don't seem to understand that they're making that type of misstep. They don't seem to see where their thinking has taken them wrong. Now, even more strikingly inconsistent, I'm focusing kind of here on these individuals. They're known as the new atheists, and so they're very outspoken. They're very well known. That's why I keep talking about them. Even more strikingly inconsistent is one of these two individuals will condemn all religious actions as judgmental, right? They're judgmental. Religious people who are acting are judgmental. And this individual said, being judgmental is wrong. We shouldn't do it. And he said, how dare you tell someone their actions are immoral? Right? So I'm going to read that again. Think about this. Being judgmental is wrong. You shouldn't do it. How dare you tell someone their actions are immoral? Okay, now think about those declarations for just a second. It should be pointed out here in the first declaration, he said it's wrong to be judgmental, but that's a judgmental statement. The statement, being judgmental is wrong, is a judgmental statement. So by its own criteria, it's self-contradictory. It's telling you not to be judgmental, while he, in this particular case, he's being judgmental about these individuals who are being judgmental. So apparently the only thing he can't stand about judgmental people is that they are judgmental all the time. He is, in this case, being a judgmental individual. Then he said, how dare you tell someone that their actions are immoral? Well, what he's implying here is that it's immoral to tell people that their actions are immoral. Well, that's self-contradictory as well. It's immoral to tell people their actions are immoral. What he's saying is that your actions are immoral. You should not tell people their actions are immoral. It's an immoral thing to do. But he's saying, by saying it's an immoral thing to do, that these actions are immoral. And other people are doing it, so he's declared these individuals to be immoral in the way they act. They need to be very consistent and need to understand when their statements are self-contradictory, right? And so that's the thing. It's part of the thing. It's part of the difficulty that these individuals are facing here. One of the new atheists, Sam Harris, that we've already mentioned, declared that teaching children religion is child abuse. And there within that statement, he's implying that teaching children religion is wrong, because assuming that child abuse is wrong, and assuming that this is child abuse, then teaching children religion is child abuse and therefore wrong, right? So you can kind of see the logical progression as it's working out. But again, with Sam Harris, how can that be wrong if there's no absolute right and wrong? That's just one human's opinion, in this case, Sam Harris. So it's just an opinion. It's not necessarily right or wrong. So they need to kind of look at what they're saying, understand the difficulties that they're facing, and try to be more consistent in what it is that they're declaring. Many people want to declare there is no objective moral right and wrong when it's convenient for them or for their position. However, we find that as soon as there is some type of violation of their perception of right and wrong, they stand on a rooftop and they yell and they cry and they scream and they complain that this is immoral. But you cannot declare that there is no right or wrong and then turn around and declare that these actions over here are right and wrong. You cannot do it. It is an intellectual, it's a logical misstep. It is illogical. You are contradicting yourselves. So you've got to think through these things rationally and come to the understanding of when you're making that type of mental mistake, that kind of logical mistake. Okay, here is the conclusion. Does any of this mean that God exists? No. No, it absolutely doesn't mean that there's a deity of any sort. All that any of this means is that we should not kid ourselves about our options. We really have two options. Either there's a deity of some sort, and therefore there can be objective moral rights and wrongs, or there is no deity, and therefore there is no objective moral rights and wrongs. Now, if you can come up with another option, keep in mind it's going to have to be logical. Keep in mind that it can't be man-made. Keep in mind that it can't be founded on chemistry or nature or anything like that, because there is nothing in chemistry or nature that just is right or wrong. It can't be founded on opinion. It can't be founded on a group of individuals and what they think. It has to be founded on something that is aside from those things. If you can come up with another option, certainly please let me know, because this is the only two options that I have been able to find, and I've been studying this for quite some time now. I'm not going to tell you how many years I've been studying this, but after studying this for many, many years, those are our options. If there's a deity, there can be a foundation for objective moral rights and wrongs. If there is no deity, there's no foundation for objective moral rights and wrongs, and therefore there's no such thing as morality. Everything is subjective. So those are our options. You can figure out which one it is that you think might be the case, but don't kid yourself. Face up to these are the options. And so if you think that there are objective moral rights and wrongs, then you might need to reconsider. If you're an atheist, you might need to reconsider the idea that you have of whether or not that deity exists. Now, if you're someone who does believe in a deity, but you don't believe in objective moral rights and wrongs, you need to reconsider your position as well, because you might have, and you don't necessarily have to have. It's not logically impossible for you to have. But in this case, you need to reconsider your position, because if there is a deity, there's at least the possibility of objective moral rights and wrongs. It's not definite. There could be a deity out there who just does not care and did not establish objective moral rights and wrongs. That's a logical possibility, but you should reconsider the different options that are there within them. So there are some questions that I often get at the end of this lecture in class from many of my students, right? Now, as soon as I get done and I say these are options and we shouldn't kid ourselves, I mean, hands go up, right? And here's some things that are said. Often I'm asked, which God or God? And here I have the big G God, right? And so the name God, the Judeo-Christian Muslim one, the God underlined, the one that I talk about in my lectures all the time. So which God or gods or goddess or goddesses, which God? How could we possibly know which God it is that, well, in this case, it's irrelevant which deity it is that exists. It makes no difference if it is the big G God, the small underlined G God, just a plain old little g, no underlined God, goddess, that makes no difference. The question that's being asked here is there a foundation for morality? And the answer, the logical answer here is, if there's a deity, that's a possibility, and if there's not one, then there is no possibility for that. Which God or goddesses or whatever else makes no difference. That's irrelevant to that question. There must be a deity of some sort, or deities of some sort, in order for there to be a foundation for morality. Another question that I almost always get: how could we know that this deity or deities expect from us morally? How do we know that? And usually what the student is doing or is about to do is object to some type of sacred text. And so, look at this sacred text and look at that sacred text. They disagree, or, this one's a pile of garbage, or, whatever kind of declaration it is they're about to make. And in this case, that's also irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference how it is that we figure out whether it is from a sacred text, how we figure out what it is that they want from us, whether it's from a sacred text or whether it's something that seems to be intrinsically woven into us. It makes no difference how we come to understand, or if we come to understand, how that being wants us to behave morally. We might not grasp what it is that being wants. Even though we seem to struggle with morality, maybe we don't know. Maybe that being doesn't reveal itself to us. That's also a possibility. So, but those questions are irrelevant. The question here is, if there's a deity, then we could have a foundation for morality. If there's not one, then we don't. And it doesn't matter how we come to know what is moral and what is immoral for this question. Another one that I get, is it possible that it's a God that's out there that we don't even know about? And the answer to that question is, well, sure. Maybe there's a God out there that has not revealed itself to humanity, that set us up to be moral creatures, but still hasn't revealed itself. That might be possible. But that question is also irrelevant, as is the answer that I just gave to the question. It's all irrelevant to the question of, is there an objective foundation for morality? It doesn't matter. The answer to that question doesn't matter for this question. Now, let me kind of then say, all of those questions matter tremendously, but they're not questions that matter for this particular question. So we have to answer this question first, and once we get an answer to that question, then we can begin to wonder about answers to all of these other questions that come after it. I suppose, fortunately or unfortunately for you, those are questions that aren't going to be answered here. Many of you are thinking, thank goodness he's not going to try to answer that question now. Well, that's many years of study and certainly a different class, and I think probably in a philosophy of religion or a world religions class or something like that. Then you go explore those particular questions. But there aren't questions that are relevant to this question and to this answer. And so I won't attempt to give you an answer to those things there. I've studied them. They're fantastic. Go study them. But they're not relevant to this one, and I'm certainly running out of time. So for our class, for what we're trying to do, the question is whether or not there's a foundation for objective moral values, and the answer seems here to be, if there's a deity, that's possible. And if there's not one and everything is just chemistry and nature, then it would seem that the answer is no. Again, go do your own research. Many of my students at this point disagree, or, I don't like that. Right? Now, remember, what you like doesn't ultimately matter when it comes to reality. Go find some good reason for taking another position. I'm not always comfortable even with this position. I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I certainly will ask you, if you come to me and you say, I think you're wrong, I think there could be another answer, I'm going to ask you to back up. I'm going to ask you to give me evidence for your position, as I have searched for the counter evidence, certainly to this position as well. I don't always reveal my position to my students. I often hesitate to do that, but in this case, that is my position. I've come to believe that in order that there must be some type of deity, otherwise there is no such thing as objective moral rights and wrongs. I have not told you whether or not I believe such a deity exists, although in this case I don't mind telling you that I do. I think there must be some type of deity out there, and that is why we seem to have this overwhelming sense of moral rights and wrongs. I think that seems to be part of our who we are as humans. Which God? I'm not going to try to address that. I'm not going to tell you which one. Just saying that's the position that I take in this case. You can agree or disagree, as long as you bring evidence for whichever position you take. All right, well, that is quite a lot, and I'm certain a whole lot to think about, so ponder those things, and we will come back next time.